Sometimes the moment that changes everything happens in the most ordinary of places. For Andrea Martinez, that moment came at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, sitting around her mother's mahogany dining table in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. The same table where she'd eaten countless birthday dinners, homework sessions, and holiday meals. The same table where her dreams would be shattered with just 5 words from the person who was supposed to love her most. But this story isn't about that moment of devastation. It's about what happened next. It's about how sometimes the worst thing someone can say to you becomes the very thing that sets you free.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Andrea Martinez had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head during the 2-hour drive from Tucson to Phoenix. 23 years old, fresh out of Arizona State University with a degree in elementary education, she thought she had her life mapped out perfectly. Teach for a few years, maybe travel during summer breaks, eventually settle down when the right person came along. The pregnancy test she'd taken 3 weeks ago had rewritten that entire script. The positive result had been shocking, but not unwelcome. She and her boyfriend Jake Thompson had been together for 2 years, living together for 8 months in a cozy apartment near the university. Jake worked as a junior architect at a firm downtown, and while they weren't officially engaged, they'd talked about marriage, about buying a house someday, about the future they wanted to build together. When Andrea first told Jake about the pregnancy, his reaction had been everything she'd hoped for. After the initial surprise wore off, his face had broken into the biggest smile she'd ever seen. He'd swept her up in his arms right there in their tiny kitchen, spinning her around while she laughed and cried happy tears at the same time. "We're going to be parents," he'd whispered against her hair, and the way he said it, with such wonder and joy, had made Andrea fall in love with him all over again. They'd spent the following weeks making tentative plans. Jake had already started looking at 3-bedroom apartments, insisting they'd need the extra space for a nursery and eventually a playroom. Andrea had researched school districts, even though their baby wouldn't be school age for years. They'd agreed to wait until after the first trimester to tell their families, but at 10 weeks, Andrea felt ready to share their joy with the people who mattered most. Her mother, Elena Martinez, had always been a formidable woman. At 51, she managed a busy dental practice in Phoenix and had raised Andrea and her older brother Carlos as a single mother after their father left when Andrea was 12. Elena had worked double shifts, taken night classes to advance her career, and sacrificed countless personal opportunities to ensure her children had every advantage she'd never had. Education first, always, had been Elena's mantra throughout Andrea's childhood. Men come and go, but your degree is something no one can ever take away from you. Andrea respected her mother's strength and dedication, but she'd also grown up feeling the weight of Elena's expectations. Every report card, every college application, every life decision had been measured against Elena's vision of success. Even now, living independently and supporting herself through her teaching job, Andrea still found herself seeking her mother's approval on major decisions. That's why telling her about the pregnancy felt so important. Andrea wanted her mother's blessing, her excitement, her support during this incredible new chapter. She wanted Elena to see that this wasn't a derailment of Andrea's plans, it was an evolution of them. Carlos would be there too, along with his wife Jessica and their 8-year-old twins, Miguel and Sofia. Andrea adored her nephews and often babysat them during school breaks. The boys called her Tia Dre and always begged her to stay longer whenever she visited. She imagined them being thrilled about having a new cousin to play with. The dinner invitation had been Elena's idea. "Come home this weekend," she'd said during their weekly phone call. "I'm making your favorite, chicken enchiladas with that verde sauce you love. Carlos and the family will be here too. We haven't all been together in months." It seemed like perfect timing. Andrea pictured herself making the announcement after dessert, maybe when they were all relaxed and full, sitting around the table sharing family stories like they always did. She had imagined Elena's surprised gasp, followed by tears of joy. She'd pictured Carlos teasing Jake about becoming an uncle, and the twins jumping up and down with excitement about their future cousin. The drive from Tucson had been filled with nervous energy. Jake sat in the passenger seat of Andrea's Honda Civic, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand when he noticed her gripping the steering wheel too tightly. "She's going to be thrilled," he'd said probably the 10th time as they pulled off the interstate. "You're her daughter. This is her first grandchild. Of course she's going to be happy." Andrea nodded, but something in her stomach felt tighter than usual, and not just from the morning sickness that had been plaguing her for weeks. She couldn't shake the memory of their conversation 6 months ago, when Andrea had mentioned that she and Jake were thinking about moving in together. "Just be careful, mija," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of caution. "You're still so young. Don't let anyone derail the plans you've worked so hard for." But this was different, Andrea told herself. This wasn't about being derailed. This was about building something beautiful with someone she loved. Elena's house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in a middle-class neighborhood she'd moved in when Andrea was in high school. The small but well-maintained ranch-style home represented everything Elena had worked for: stability, respectability, independence. The front yard was meticulously landscaped, and I could see the warm glow of lights through the living room windows. Carlos's truck was already in the driveway, which meant the whole family was here. Andrea's heart rate picked up as she and Jake walked up the familiar stone pathway to the front door. The smell of cumin and chilies drifted from the kitchen, and I could hear the twins' laughter echoing from somewhere inside the house. "Deep breath," Jake whispered, giving her hand one final squeeze before she knocked. The door swung open to reveal Miguel, now 8 and all gangly limbs and missing teeth. "Tia Dre!" he shouted, launching himself into her arms with the enthusiasm only children possessed. "Hey, buddy!" Andrea hugged him tight, breathing in that kid smell of shampoo and playground dirt. "Where's your brother?" "Sophia's helping Abuela in the kitchen. She said she's making flan for dessert, and she said I could help, but then she banned me because I kept eating the sugar." Andrea laughed, some of her nervousness melting away. This was her family, her home. These people loved her. Everything was going to be fine. The living room hadn't changed much since her last visit. Family photos covered the mantelpiece and side tables. Andrea's high school graduation, Carlos's wedding, the twins at various ages, Elena receiving some award at work. The furniture was the same comfortable but practical pieces Elena had bought when they first moved in, and the walls still held Andrea's childhood artwork alongside Carlos's high school football trophies.
"Andrea!" Jessica appeared from the direction of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Carlos's wife was a warm, bubbly woman who worked as a nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospital and had welcomed Andrea into the family with open arms from the moment she and Carlos started dating in college. "And Jake," Jessica continued, pulling him into a hug. "How are you guys? How's the new apartment?" They chatted for a few minutes about work, about Jake's latest project at the architecture firm, about Andrea's second-grade class and their upcoming field trip to the zoo. Normal family conversation that helped settle Andrea's nerves even more. "Mom's in the kitchen with Sophia. You know how she gets when she's cooking for everyone. Total control mode. I was banished for suggesting we could help set the table." Andrea smiled. Her mother's need to control every detail of family gatherings was legendary. Elena took pride in hosting, in making sure everything was perfect, in demonstrating through elaborate meals how much she cared for her family. "I'll go say hi," Andrea said, heading toward the kitchen with Jake close behind. The kitchen was Elena's domain, and it showed. Every surface was spotless, ingredients arranged in precise order, multiple pots simmering on the stove. Elena moved through the space with practiced efficiency, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the apron Andrea had given her for Mother's Day 3 years ago. Sophia, Miguel's twin sister, stood on a step stool at the counter, carefully measuring ingredients for the flan under her grandmother's watchful eye. At 8, she was already showing signs of Elena's perfectionist streak, her small face serious with concentration. "Mija!" Elena looked up as Andrea entered, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. She wiped her hands on her apron before pulling Andrea into a warm embrace. "You look good. Teaching agrees with you." "Thanks, Mom. It smells incredible in here."
Elena turned to Jake next, accepting his hug with the polite warmth she'd shown him over the past 2 years. Elena liked Jake well enough. He was respectful, educated, came from a good family, but Andrea sometimes sensed her mother's subtle reservation, as if she was waiting for him to prove himself worthy of her daughter's attention. "Jake, good to see you. How's work?" "Really good, Mrs. Martinez. We just got approval for a new community center downtown. It's going to be my first project as lead designer." "That's wonderful," Elena said, and Andrea could hear the genuine approval in her voice. Elena respected ambition and professional achievement above almost everything else. They spent the next few minutes in comfortable family chaos. Carlos appeared to steal bites of food, earning swats from Elena's wooden spoon. The twins ran in and out, getting underfoot, until Jessica corralled them. Jake offered to help and was politely but firmly declined. Finally, Elena announced that dinner was ready, and they all gathered around the familiar mahogany table. The enchiladas were perfect, as always, smothered in Elena's signature green chili sauce that had just the right amount of heat. There was Spanish rice, refried beans, fresh tortillas, and a salad that Elena insisted everyone eat for the vitamins. Conversation flowed easily around the table. Carlos told stories about his latest construction projects. Jessica shared funny incidents from the hospital. The twins competed for attention with tales from school. Andrea found herself relaxing completely, reminded of why she loved these family dinners so much. This was the right time, she decided. Everyone was happy, full, in good spirits. The mood was perfect for sharing good news. As Elena started clearing the dinner plates, preparing to serve the flan Sophia had helped make, Andrea caught Jake's eye across the table. He raised his eyebrows slightly, their prearranged signal, and she nodded. "Actually, before dessert," Andrea said, her voice carrying over the general conversation, "Jake and I have something we wanted to share with everyone." The table quieted, all eyes turning toward her. Elena paused in her clearing, a stack of plates in her hands, looking at Andrea with curious expectation. Andrea's heart was pounding, but it was good nerves now, the kind you get before something wonderful. She reached for Jake's hand under the table, drawing strength from his presence. "We're having a baby," she said, the words coming out in a rush of joy and excitement. "I'm 10 weeks pregnant. We wanted to tell you all together because family is so important to us, and we want this baby to be surrounded by all the love and support we've always felt from you." For a moment, the silence stretched. Andrea looked around the table, waiting for the explosion of congratulations she'd imagined. Sophia looked confused. She probably wasn't entirely sure what pregnant meant. Miguel was still focused on the last bits of rice on his plate. Carlos and Jessica were exchanging glances, processing the news. But it was her mother's reaction that stopped Andrea's heart. Elena had gone completely still, the plates forgotten in her hands. Her face, which moments before had been warm and animated, had turned to stone. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, cold, completely devoid of the joy Andrea had been so desperately hoping for. "Great," Elena said, the single word dripping with disappointment and barely contained anger. "Another mistake." The plates clattered as Elena set them down harder than necessary and walked out of the dining room without another word, leaving behind a silence so complete that Andrea could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting out the seconds of her shattered expectations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The grandfather clock continued its relentless ticking as Andrea sat frozen at the dining room table, Elena's words echoing in her mind like a slap that kept reverberating. Another mistake. The phrase carved itself into her consciousness, each syllable sharp enough to draw blood. Jake's hand found hers under the table, his grip tight and protective, but Andrea barely registered the contact. She stared at the empty doorway where her mother had disappeared, waiting for Elena to return, to explain, to take back the words that had just shattered everything Andrea thought she knew about their relationship. "Andrea, Jessica's voice was gentle, careful, the way nurses spoke to patients receiving devastating news. I'm sure she didn't mean. She meant it. The words came out of Andrea's mouth before she could stop them, hollow and certain. She knew her mother well enough to recognize when Elena's filter disappeared and raw truth came spilling out. There had been no heat in those words, no momentary anger that might be explained away later, just cold, calculated disappointment. Carlos cleared his throat, his weathered hands fidgeting with his napkin. At 31, he was 8 years older than Andrea and had always tried to play the protective big brother role, but even he seemed at a loss for how to handle this situation. Mom's just surprised, he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. You know how she gets when things don't go according to her plans. Remember when I dropped out of college to work construction? She didn't speak to me for 3 months. That was different, Andrea said, her voice gaining strength as anger began to mix with the hurt. You were 19 and failing half your classes. This isn't about dropping out or making some impulsive decision. I'm 23 years old. I have a degree. I have a job. I'm in a committed relationship. How is having a baby with someone I love a mistake? The twins had gone quiet, sensing the adult tension even if they didn't fully understand its source. Miguel pushed his fork around his plate, while Sophia looked between the adults with wide, worried eyes. Maybe we should take the boys into the living room, Jessica suggested, already standing and gently guiding the children away from the table. Let you guys talk. But what was there to talk about? Andrea watched her sister-in-law shepherd the twins out of the room, leaving her alone with Carlos and Jake. The elegant dinner that had started with such promise now felt like a crime scene, the carefully prepared plates of food growing cold, while the family that was supposed to celebrate her news fell apart around the edges. I should go talk to her, Carlos said, pushing back from the table. No, Andrea's voice was sharper than she intended. Don't you dare make excuses for her. Don't you dare try to fix this like it's just some misunderstanding. The sound of Elena's voice drifted from the kitchen. Not words, just the sharp clatter of dishes being washed with more force than necessary. It was a sound Andrea remembered from childhood, the aggressive cleaning that happened whenever Elena was furious, but trying to contain it. Jake's hand squeezed Andrea's hand again, and this time she looked at him, really looked at him. His face was tight with barely controlled anger, his jaw clenched in a way she had only seen a few times before. Jake was typically even-tempered, the kind of man who talked through problems rather than letting emotions take over. But right now, he looked like he wanted to march into that kitchen and defend Andrea's honor in very direct terms. We should go, he said quietly. We don't need to sit here and take this. But Andrea couldn't move. Some part of her was still waiting for her mother to come back, to apologize, to explain that she'd been shocked and said something she didn't mean. Some part of her was still that little girl who needed Elena's approval more than she needed air. She called my baby a mistake, Andrea whispered, the words finally sinking in completely. She called the grandchild she doesn't even know yet a mistake. Carlos ran a hand through his dark hair, looking older than his 31 years old. Andrea, you know Mom. She sees the world in terms of timing and planning. In her mind, you just graduated, you're just starting your career. Stop. Andrea stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Just stop making excuses for her. You want to know what I think? I think she's been waiting for me to mess up. I think she's been waiting for me to prove that I'm just like my dad, impulsive and irresponsible and destined to disappoint her. The comparison hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Their father, Roberto, had left when Andrea was 12 and Carlos was 20, walking out on his family to move to California with a woman 15 years younger. Elena had never spoken about him with anything but bitter disappointment, and Andrea had grown up understanding that the worst thing you could be was unreliable, unpredictable, someone who made decisions based on feelings rather than logic. That's not fair, Carlos said, but his protest sounded weak even to him. Isn't it? Andrea could feel tears threatening, but she was too angry to let them fall. Think about it, Carlos. When you dropped out of college, what did she say? When you started working construction instead of finishing your degree, how did she react? Carlos shifted uncomfortably.
She was disappointed, but she came around. She came around because Jessica got pregnant with the twins and suddenly Mom had grandchildren to focus on. But what did she say to you before that? What did she say to you when you told her you were going to marry Jessica instead of going back to school? Carlos's silence was answer enough. I remember those fights. I remember Elena's furious phone calls to relatives, complaining about her son throwing his life away for a girl he got pregnant. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She thinks we're both just like him, Andrea continued, her voice getting stronger. She thinks we're both destined to make the same impulsive, destructive choices that he made. Jake stood up, moving to Andrea's side with the protective instinct of a man who'd watched the woman he loved take a devastating blow. You are nothing like your father, he said firmly. This baby isn't a mistake, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be part of our lives.
But she's my mother, Andrea said. And suddenly, the tears did come, hot and fast and full of 23 years of trying to earn Elena's approval. She's supposed to be happy for me. She's supposed to want to be involved in her grandchild's life. The kitchen had gone quiet, which somehow felt worse than the angry dish clattering. Elena's silence was a wall, impenetrable and cold. Carlos stood up, clearly torn between loyalty to his sister and some ingrained need to keep the family peace. Let me try to talk to her. Maybe if I explain? Explain what? Andrea wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Explain that I'm an adult who's capable of making her own decisions. Explain that Jake and I love each other and we're excited about this baby. Explain that maybe, just maybe, an unplanned pregnancy doesn't automatically equal a ruined life? She's scared, Carlos said quietly. She's scared you're going to end up struggling like she did when Dad left. She worked so hard to give us opportunities she never had, and I think she sees this as you giving up on those opportunities. But I'm not giving up anything. Andrea's voice rose, frustration bleeding through the hurt. I'm not dropping out of school. I already graduated. I'm not quitting my job. They have maternity leave policies. I'm not abandoning some grand career plan. I want to teach, and I can still teach. Having a baby doesn't mean my life is over. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sound of Jessica in the living room, talking quietly to the twins. Andrea could hear the grandfather clock ticking, marking time that felt suspended, moments that were reshaping everything she thought she knew about her family. Maybe she just needs time, Carlos offered weakly. Time for what? Time to accept that I'm not the perfect daughter she wanted? Time to figure out how to love a grandchild she's already labeled a mistake? No, I'm done waiting for her approval. I'm done trying to fit into whatever mold she's created for me. Jake put his arm around her shoulders, solid and warm and reassuring. We should go home, he said softly. We don't need to put you through any more of this tonight. Andrea nodded, suddenly exhausted. The emotional whiplash of the evening, from nervous excitement to crushing disappointment to burning anger, had left her drained. She looked around the dining room one more time, at the family photos on the sideboard, at the carefully set table that had been meant for celebration, at the doorway where her mother had delivered her devastating verdict, and then simply walked away. I need to get my purse, she said quietly. As they prepared to leave, Jessica emerged from the living room, her face full of sympathy and confusion. Andrea, honey, I'm so sorry. I don't know what got into her. It's not your fault, Andrea said, managing a weak smile for her sister-in-law. Thank you for being kind to us. Tell the boys I said goodbye. Jessica nodded, pulling Andrea into a fierce hug. Congratulations, she whispered. I'm excited about this baby, even if she can't be right now. The words were meant to be comforting, but they only highlighted the absence Andrea felt most keenly. As they walked to the front door, she could hear Elena moving around in the kitchen, maintaining the pretense that nothing extraordinary had happened, that she hadn't just rejected her daughter's joy and called her unborn grandchild a mistake. Carlos walked them to the car, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face troubled. Andrea, just don't make any permanent decisions tonight, okay? Don't let this one moment define everything. But as Andrea slid into the passenger seat of Jake's truck, she realized that Carlos was wrong. This hadn't been one moment, it had been a revelation.
All those years of trying to earn Elena's approval, all those careful choices designed to make her mother proud, all that effort to be the perfect daughter who never disappointed anyone. And for what? So that when the most important moment of her life arrived, when she wanted to share her joy with the person who was supposed to love her unconditionally, she could be dismissed with 5 cold words that cut deeper than any scream ever could. As they drove away from the house where Andrea had grown up, where she'd brought home report cards and prom pictures and college acceptance letters, she realized something had fundamentally shifted. The little girl who had lived her life seeking Elena Martinez's approval was gone, left behind in that dining room along with the remnants of a family dinner that was supposed to have been a celebration. The woman sitting in this truck, pregnant with a child who would never doubt her mother's love, was someone entirely different. Someone who was just beginning to understand what that meant.
The drive back to Tucson passed in heavy silence. Jake kept stealing glances at Andrea as she stared out the passenger window, watching the desert landscape blur past in the darkness. The usual 2-hour journey felt endless, each mile marked by the weight of unspoken words and the echo of Elena's crushing dismissal. It wasn't until they were pulling into the parking lot of their apartment complex that Andrea finally spoke. "I need to call in sick tomorrow," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "I can't face a classroom full of 7-year-olds right now." Jake turned off the engine, but didn't immediately get out of the truck. "Are you sure? Sometimes staying busy helps." Andrea shook her head. "I'd probably just cry in front of the kids. That's not fair to them." She rubbed her temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. "Besides, I need to figure out what I'm going to do about the rest of my family, about whether I even want them in this baby's life." The thought was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Andrea had never seriously considered the possibility of cutting ties with Elena, but tonight had changed something fundamental. The unconditional love she'd always assumed existed, the safety net she'd counted on, had been revealed as conditional after all. Their apartment felt different when they walked in, though nothing had changed. The same secondhand furniture, the same stack of Jake's architectural drawings on the coffee table, the same collection of Andrea's teaching supplies scattered across the kitchen counter, but somehow the space felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on possibilities that had seemed unlimited just hours before. "I'm going to take a shower," Andrea said, heading toward the bedroom without waiting for Jake's response. The hot water felt good against her skin, but it couldn't wash away the conversation that kept replaying in her mind. Another mistake. The words had lodged themselves in her consciousness like a splinter, impossible to ignore and getting more painful the more she thought about them. By the time she emerged from the bathroom in her pajamas, Jake had made tea and was sitting on their small couch, his laptop open but clearly not working on anything. He looked up when she entered the living room, his expression careful and concerned. "Feeling any better?" Andrea curled up next to him, accepting the warm mug gratefully. "Not really. I keep thinking about what she said and I keep getting angrier." "Good," Jake said firmly. "You should be angry. What she said was cruel and wrong." "But what if she's right?" The question tumbled out before Andrea could stop it. "What if this is a mistake? What if I'm not ready? What if I'm just like my father, making impulsive decisions that hurt everyone around me?" Jake set down his laptop and turned to face her fully. "Andrea, look at me. You are nothing like your father. You've never made an impulsive decision in your life. You planned out every semester of college. You researched teaching programs for months before applying. You saved money for 2 years before we moved in together. This pregnancy might be unplanned, but that doesn't make it a mistake." Andrea wanted to believe him, but Elena's voice was louder in her head than Jake's reassurance. Her mother had always been the practical one, the voice of reason, the person who saw potential problems before anyone else did. What if her harsh reaction came from a place of wisdom, rather than cruelty? "I should call Carlos, see if she said anything else after we left." Jake's expression darkened. "Why would you do that to yourself? You know she didn't apologize. You know she didn't suddenly realize she was wrong." "But maybe—" "No maybes," Jake said gently but firmly. "You can't keep looking for reasons to forgive her when she hasn't even acknowledged that she hurt you." Before Andrea could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. Her heart leaped, thinking it might be Elena with an apology, but the name on the screen made her pause. Mrs. Rodriguez. Carmen Rodriguez had been Andrea's supervising teacher during her student teaching placement the previous year. More than just a professional mentor and confidant, she'd become a friend and confidant,
someone Andrea turned to when she needed advice about classroom management or difficult parents or navigating the politics of elementary education. Saw your mom at the grocery store tonight. She looked upset. Everything okay? Text me if you need to talk. Andrea stared at the message, torn between gratitude that someone cared and embarrassment that Elena had apparently been publicly displaying her distress. Of course she'd run into Mrs. Rodriguez. Tucson was big enough to get lost in, but small enough that you inevitably encountered people you knew at the most inconvenient times. Who is it? Jake asked, noting her expression. Mrs. Rodriguez. She saw my mom somewhere and could tell something was wrong. Andrea held up the phone. Should I text her back? Do you want to? Andrea considered this. Carmen Rodriguez was 62 years old, a grandmother of 5, and had been teaching for nearly 40 years. She'd seen everything the education world could throw at her and had developed a reputation for being both tough and compassionate. More importantly, she'd been pregnant 4 times during her teaching career and had successfully balanced motherhood with her professional ambitions. If anyone could give Andrea perspective on this situation, it would be Carmen. Can I call you? Andrea texted back. The response came immediately. Of course! Give me 5 minutes to put the kids to bed. Babysitting duty tonight. Andrea felt a small smile tug at her lips despite everything. Carmen was always babysitting one grandchild or another, always involved in school projects and soccer games and dance recitals. She made being a working mother and grandmother look effortless, though Andrea knew it was anything but. 10 minutes later, Andrea was sitting on her small balcony, phone pressed to her ear, while Jake cleaned up their untouched dinner from earlier. Okay, mija, Carmen's warm voice came through clearly. Tell me what happened. And so Andrea did. She started with the excitement of the pregnancy announcement and ended with Elena's devastating response and their abrupt departure. Carmen listened without interruption, making only small sounds of sympathy and encouragement. When Andrea finished, there was a long pause before Carmen spoke. Your mother said those things to you? Called your pregnancy a mistake? Maybe she was just shocked. Maybe she just... Andrea, stop. Carmen's voice was gentle but firm. I've known your mother for 15 years, since you were in my 3rd grade class. I've seen her at school events, parent conferences, graduation ceremonies. She's a strong woman who's accomplished a lot, but she's also someone who believes there's only one right way to live life. Her way.
Andrea felt tears starting again. But what if she's right? What if having a baby now really is a mistake? Let me ask you something, Carmen said. When you found out you were pregnant, what was your first feeling? Not your second thought or your worried consideration, your very first emotional reaction. Andrea closed her eyes, remembering that moment 3 weeks ago when she'd stared at the positive pregnancy test in her tiny bathroom. Joy, she said quietly. I felt joy, and then I felt scared, but underneath the fear, I was happy. That's not the reaction of someone making a mistake, Carmen said firmly. That's the reaction of someone whose heart knows something her head hasn't caught up to yet. A cool breeze moved across the balcony, carrying the scent of desert sage and the distant sound of traffic. Andrea pulled her robe tighter around herself, feeling somehow lighter than she had all evening. I don't understand why she reacted that way, Andrea said. I thought she'd be excited about becoming a grandmother. Your mother has spent her entire adult life proving that she doesn't need anyone, Carmen said thoughtfully. She raised 2 children alone, built a career, bought her own house, created her own security. In her mind, independence is survival. The idea of you becoming dependent on a man, even temporarily, probably terrifies her. But I'm not becoming dependent on Jake. We're partners. I know that, and you know that. But your mother sees pregnancy and motherhood through the lens of her own experience. She was young and dependent when she had you and Carlos. And look how that turned out. Your father left her to raise 2 children alone. Andrea had never thought about it that way. Elena had been 26 when Andrea was born, just 3 years older than Andrea was now. But Elena had been married to a man who turned out to be unreliable, while Andrea was with someone who'd already proven his commitment and partnership. She's projecting her fears onto your situation.
That doesn't make what she said okay, but it might help you understand where it came from. So what do I do now? Carmen was quiet for a moment, and Andrea could picture her sitting in her own kitchen, probably grading papers or preparing lessons for the next day, even while offering late-night counseling to a former student. You focus on what you can control, Carmen said finally. You take care of yourself and your baby. You build the support system you need, whether or not your mother chooses to be part of it. And you remember that becoming a mother doesn't mean giving up who you are. It means adding another dimension to who you already are. But what about my career? What about the plans I had? What plans? Carmen's voice held a note of gentle amusement. You wanted to teach elementary school children, right? You wanted to make a difference in young lives. Well, congratulations. You're about to get the most intensive training in child development that exists. You think understanding how kids think and learn won't make you a better teacher? Andrea felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear and doubt that had been tightening since Elena's harsh words. Besides, I've been pregnant 4 times during my teaching career. Each time, people told me I was derailing my professional goals. Each time, I proved them wrong. My children didn't hold me back. They motivated me to work harder, to be more efficient, to make every moment count. The skills you learn as a mother, multitasking, patience, creative problem solving, negotiation, those are exactly the skills that make someone an excellent teacher. Really? Really? Some of my best years in the classroom happened when my kids were little. I understood my students better because I was living with children at home. I was more organized because I had to be. I was more compassionate with parents because I knew how hard it was to balance everything. Andrea felt tears again, but these were different. Tears of relief rather than pain. For the first time since leaving Elena's house, she could imagine a future where having a baby enhanced her life rather than derailing it. Your mother will come around, Carmen said softly. She loves you, even if she has a terrible way of showing it sometimes. But don't wait for her approval to be happy about this baby. Don't let her fear steal your joy. After they hung up, Andrea sat on the balcony for several more minutes, watching the lights of Tucson twinkle in the distance. Jake eventually joined her, wrapping a blanket around both of them as they sat in comfortable silence. Feel better? He asked. Yeah, she said, and meant it. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me see things differently. She reminded me that becoming a mother doesn't mean giving up my dreams. It means expanding them. Jake kissed the top of her head. She sounds like a wise woman. She is, and she made me realize something else. What's that? Andrea placed her hand on her still, flat stomach, imagining the tiny life growing inside her. This baby is going to be so lucky to have parents who actually want them, who see them as a blessing rather than a burden. And if my mother can't see that, then that's her loss, not ours. For the first time since leaving Elena's house, Andrea genuinely felt excited about the future again. She had work to do, conversations to have, plans to make, a new kind of life to figure out. But she also had something Elena apparently never had, a partner who saw her pregnancy as a gift rather than a mistake, and a growing understanding that she didn't need her mother's permission to be happy. Tomorrow, she would start building the life she actually wanted, rather than the life Elena thought she should have. Tonight, that felt like enough.
Andrea woke up the next morning with a strange sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. The conversation with Carmen Rodriguez had shifted something fundamental in her perspective, but she knew that understanding her situation intellectually and actually living it were 2 very different things. Today would be her first real test of independence from Elena's expectations. She called in sick to work, then spent the morning researching prenatal care options in Tucson. Jake had already left for his job at the architecture firm, but not before making her promise to take it easy and call if she needed anything. The apartment felt peaceful in the morning sunlight, and for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Andrea allowed herself to truly envision what their life might look like with a baby.
The first practical step was finding an obstetrician. Andrea had been putting off making the appointment, telling herself she was waiting until after they told the families. Now she realized she'd been subconsciously waiting for Elena's approval before fully committing to the pregnancy. The recognition of that pattern made her angry with herself. When had she become someone who needed permission to take care of her own health? Dr. Sarah Chun's office was located in a modern medical complex on the east side of town. Andrea had chosen her based on online reviews that praised her patience with first-time mothers and her progressive approach to pregnancy care. The waiting room was full of women in various stages of pregnancy, some glowing with excitement, others looking tired and overwhelmed. Andrea wondered which category she fell into. Andrea Martinez? A nurse called her name, and suddenly she was being led down a hallway toward an examination room, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. Dr. Chen turned out to be a petite woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and an efficient manner that immediately put Andrea at ease. After the initial examination and blood work, they sat in her office discussing Andrea's medical history and pregnancy timeline. "Everything looks perfectly normal," Dr. Chen said, reviewing Andrea's chart. "You're measuring right on track for 11 weeks. How are you feeling emotionally? Any concerns or questions?" Andrea hesitated. She'd planned to keep the conversation purely medical, but something about Dr. Chen's genuine interest made her want to open up. "I'm dealing with some family issues," she said carefully. "Some people close to me aren't supportive of the pregnancy." Dr. Chen nodded knowingly. "Unfortunately, that's more common than you think. Pregnancy can bring out unexpected reactions in people, especially when they have their own unresolved issues around motherhood or family planning. How do you handle it when people you love don't support your choices?" "You build your own support network," Dr. Chen said simply. "Family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to love and support you unconditionally. Some of my patients have found tremendous community in prenatal classes, online forums, or even just connecting with other pregnant women in their daily lives." She handed Andrea several brochures. "There's a wonderful prenatal education series that starts next month. It covers everything from nutrition and exercise to labor preparation and newborn care. Many women find it helpful to connect with others who are going through the same experience." Andrea accepted the brochures, already feeling more grounded just from having concrete next steps. "Thank you. This feels overwhelming sometimes." "That's completely normal. First pregnancies are like stepping into a foreign country where you don't speak the language yet. But you'll learn, and you'll figure out what works for your family." Your family. The phrase hit Andrea with unexpected force. She and Jake were creating their own family now, independent of Elena's approval or disapproval. The baby growing inside her would be part of a family unit that she and Jake would define for themselves. After the appointment, Andrea stopped at a bookstore and bought 3 pregnancy guides, 2 parenting books, and a journal specifically designed for documenting pregnancy milestones. If Elena wasn't going to be excited about this grandchild, then Andrea would make sure to capture every moment herself. Sitting in the bookstore cafe with a decaf latte, she opened the pregnancy journal and stared at the first page. A letter to your unborn child. Andrea had never been much of a writer, but something about the blank page called to her. "Dear baby," she wrote, "today I learned that you're healthy and growing perfectly. I also learned that I'm going to have to be braver than I've ever been before, because some people in our family aren't ready to love you yet. But that's okay, because your daddy and I love you enough for everyone." The words flowed easier than she had expected. She wrote about her fears and hopes, about Jake's excitement when they'd first seen the positive test result, and about the dreams she had for their future together. She wrote about Elena, too, about the pain of her rejection, but also about Andrea's growing determination not to let that pain define this experience. When she looked up from the journal, an hour had passed and her latte had grown cold, but she felt more connected to her pregnancy than she had since the whole ordeal began. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "How did the appointment go?" "Everything's perfect. Baby's healthy. Doctor was amazing. I'll tell you everything when you get home. I love you both," came his immediate reply, followed by a heart emoji. Andrea smiled, feeling that warm glow of partnership that had been overshadowed by Elena's reaction. This was what mattered, this tiny family unit they were building together. The next few days fell into a new rhythm. Andrea went back to work, but with a different energy than before. She found herself paying closer attention to the children in her second-grade classroom, observing their development with fresh eyes now that she was going to be responsible for nurturing a child from birth.
Her student, Sarah Kim, was struggling with reading comprehension, and Andrea noticed how patient encouragement helped more than criticism. 7-year-old Marcus Rodriguez, no relation to Carmen, had difficulty sitting still, but when Andrea gave him specific jobs to do, passing out papers, cleaning the whiteboard, he channeled his energy productively. These small insights felt like practice for motherhood, building her confidence that she could handle the challenges ahead. But the week also brought unexpected difficulties. On Wednesday, Elena called. Andrea was in her classroom during lunch, grading math worksheets, when her phone rang. She stared at her mother's name on the screen for several rings before answering. "Hi, Mom." "Andrea." Elena's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "How are you feeling?" The question could have been casual small talk, or it could have been acknowledgement of the pregnancy. Andrea chose to interpret it as the latter. "I'm fine. Morning sickness is manageable, and I had my first prenatal appointment. Everything looks good." A pause. "That's good." Another silence stretched between them. Andrea waited, hoping Elena would apologize or explain, or somehow bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Instead, her mother's voice remained distant and formal. "Your brother thinks I was too harsh the other night." "Were you?" "I was honest about my concerns." Andrea felt her jaw clench. Even now, Elena couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the cruelty of her words. "Calling my baby a mistake isn't expressing concern, Mom. It's being hurtful." I didn't mean..." Elena started, then stopped. "Andrea, you're so young. You have so many opportunities ahead of you. I just don't want to see you limit yourself." "Having a baby doesn't limit me. It changes my path, but it doesn't limit me." "You don't know what you're talking about," Elena said, her voice sharp with frustration. "You don't know how hard it is to raise children when you're struggling financially, when you don't have support, when your partner isn't reliable." "But Jake is reliable," Andrea said firmly. "And we're not struggling financially. We both have jobs, we both have degrees. We both want this baby. This isn't your situation with Dad." Every woman thinks her partner is reliable until he isn't. The bitterness in Elena's voice was palpable, and Andrea suddenly understood that this conversation was less about her pregnancy and more about Elena's own unhealed wounds. But understanding didn't make the words hurt less. "I'm sorry Dad let you down," Andrea said quietly. "But that doesn't mean Jake will let me down. And it doesn't mean I should live my life based on your fears. I'm just trying to protect you. You're trying to control me. There's a difference." The line went quiet again. When Elena spoke, her voice was cold and final. "Call me when you're ready to have a realistic conversation about your situation." She hung up without saying goodbye. Andrea stared at her phone, shaking with anger and hurt. She'd hoped the conversation might lead to some kind of reconciliation, but instead it had only reinforced Elena's position. Her mother wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to be supportive, wasn't going to be the grandmother Andrea had envisioned for her child. That afternoon, she found herself calling Carmen Rodriguez again. "She wants me to agree that having this baby is a mistake. She wants me to validate her belief that I'm ruining my life." "And are you going to do that?" Carmen asked. "No," Andrea said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I'm not going to apologize for being happy. I'm not going to pretend this baby is unwanted just to make her feel better about her own fears." "Good for you." "But it's hard," Andrea admitted. "I keep thinking about holidays, about family gatherings, about whether my child will even know their grandmother." "That's Elena's choice to make," Carmen said gently. "You can't force someone to love your child, but you can make sure your child is surrounded by people who do." That evening, Andrea and Jake had dinner with their parents, Margaret and David Thompson. The contrast with her own family situation was stark and healing. Margaret immediately started planning nursery decorating schemes, while David offered to build a crib from scratch. They asked thoughtful questions about Andrea's health and due date, shared stories about Jake's baby years, and generally radiated the kind of grandparent excitement Andrea had hoped from Elena. "We're so thrilled," Margaret said over dessert. "David's already been researching the best strollers and car seats. He's determined to be the most prepared grandfather in Arizona." "I just want to make sure you have everything you need," David said, his eyes twinkling. "Jake was such a surprise to us. We were completely unprepared.
but this time we get to help from the beginning." Andrea felt tears of gratitude welling up. This was what family support looked like. This was the kind of love she wanted surrounding her child. "Thank you," she said simply. "This means everything to us." As they drove home that night, Andrea realized she was building something new, a chosen family of people who celebrated her pregnancy rather than merely tolerating it. Elena's rejection still hurt, but it no longer felt devastating. She had Jake's unwavering support, Carmen's wisdom, the Thompsons' enthusiasm, and her own growing confidence. Most importantly, she had a clear vision of the kind of mother she wanted to be. Supportive rather than controlling, encouraging rather than fearful. Someone who would celebrate her child's choices rather than trying to limit them. Elena had taught her what not to do. Now Andrea could focus on learning what to do instead.
3 weeks after the disastrous family dinner, Andrea made a decision that would change everything. She was sitting in her empty classroom after school, updating lesson plans for the following week, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her brother's name, and something in her chest tightened with anticipation. "Carlos? Hey, Andrea, how are you feeling?" His voice carried a warmth that had been missing from Elena's calls, and Andrea felt herself relax slightly. "Better every day. The morning sickness is finally starting to ease up. How are Jessica and the boys?" "They're good, actually. That's part of why I'm calling." Carlos paused, and Andrea could hear the sound of construction equipment in the background. He was probably on a job site, stealing a few minutes during his break. "The twins have been asking about you. They want to know when they can see you again." Andrea's heart clenched. In all the drama with Elena, she hadn't considered how her absence might affect Miguel and Sofia. The twins had always been a bright spot in family gatherings, and she'd been looking forward to watching them become big cousins. "I miss them too," she said honestly. "But I'm not sure how to navigate family events right now. Mom made her position pretty clear." "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." Carlos's voice grew more serious. "Jessica and I have been talking, and we want to throw you a baby shower." Andrea nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "A baby shower. You know, the thing people do when someone they love is having a baby. Games, gifts, terrible cake, the works." Tears sprang to Andrea's eyes without warning. "Carlos, you don't have to," he interrupted. "We want to. Andrea, you're my sister. I don't care what Mom thinks about your timing or your choices. You're having a baby, and that's something to celebrate. Jessica's already started planning. She's thinking maybe 6 weeks from now. Give you time to find out the gender if you want to, get into the second trimester properly." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Andrea couldn't speak for a moment. She'd been resigned to the idea that this pregnancy would drive a permanent wedge through her family, but here was Carlos extending an olive branch she hadn't dared hope for. "What about Mom?" she finally managed to ask. Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "We're not inviting her." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Carlos had never openly defied Elena about anything significant. He'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over family conflicts and found compromises that kept everyone happy. For him to deliberately exclude their mother from a family celebration was unprecedented. "Carlos, I can't ask you to choose between, you're not asking, I'm choosing." His voice was firm, resolute. "What she said to you was unforgivable. Jessica and I talked about it for hours after you left that night. We have 2 kids, Andrea. We know how hard it is to raise children, but we also know how much joy they bring. For Mom to call your baby a mistake? I can't support that." Andrea sank into her desk chair, overwhelmed by her brother's unexpected solidarity. "Are you sure? This could cause permanent problems between you and Mom." "There are already permanent problems between Mom and you," Carlos pointed out. "And honestly, maybe it's time someone in this family stood up to her. She's been controlling all of us for so long that we forgot we have the right to disagree with her." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Jessica and Carlos's enthusiasm infectious through the phone. They talked about venues, guest lists, themes. Jessica had already reached out to some of Andrea's college friends and teaching colleagues. They were planning to invite Jake's parents, Carmen Rodriguez, and several of Andrea's coworkers who had become friends over the past year. When Andrea finally hung up, she sat in her quiet classroom for a long time, processing what had just happened. Carlos wasn't just offering to throw her a party, he was officially choosing sides in the family schism. He was saying that Elena's behavior was unacceptable and that he was willing to face the consequences of opposing her. The weight of that support was overwhelming and empowering at the same time. That evening, Andrea and Jake drove to Carlos and Jessica's house in Phoenix for dinner. It was the first time Andrea had been back in the city since the disastrous announcement, and she felt nervous as they pulled into the familiar subdivision. Elena lived only 15 minutes away, and the proximity made Andrea feel exposed and vulnerable. But the moment Jessica opened the front door, those worries evaporated. She was pulled into a fierce hug, followed immediately by Miguel and Sophia launching themselves at her with the uninhibited enthusiasm of children who had missed their favorite aunt. "Tia Andre," Sophia squealed, "Daddy says you're having a baby. Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" "We don't know yet," Andrea said, crouching down to Sophia's level. "What do you think it should be?"
A girl, Sophia declared immediately. Boys are gross. "Hey," Miguel protested, "I'm not gross." "You ate a bug yesterday," Sophia replied with devastating 8-year-old logic. Andrea laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. This was what she'd been missing, the easy joy of family relationships, uncomplicated by judgment or fear. Dinner was relaxed and celebratory. Carlos grilled burgers in the backyard while Jessica showed Andrea baby photos on her phone, reminiscing about the twins' early years. The boys peppered Andrea with questions about babies, where they came from, how big they were, whether they could play soccer immediately after being born. "Uncle Jake," Miguel said seriously, "are you excited about being a daddy?" Jake's face lit up with the biggest smile Andrea had seen since their announcement. "I'm very excited, buddy. I can't wait to teach the baby all the things your dad taught me about being a good person." "Like how to use tools?" "Exactly like that." Andrea watched the interaction with a full heart. This was what she'd been missing, the easy joy of family relationships. Dinner was relaxed and celebratory. Carlos grilled burgers in the backyard while Jessica showed Andrea baby photos on her phone, reminiscing about the twins' early years. The boys peppered Andrea with questions about babies, where they came from, how big they were, whether they could play soccer immediately after being born. "Uncle Jake," Miguel said seriously, "are you excited about being a daddy?" Jake's face lit up with the biggest smile Andrea had seen since their announcement. "I'm very excited, buddy. I can't wait to teach the baby all the things your dad taught me about being a good person." "Like how to use tools?" "Exactly like that." Andrea watched the interaction with a full heart. This was the kind of environment she wanted for her child, surrounded by cousins who would love them unconditionally, aunts and uncles who would be actively involved in their lives, extended family who saw children as blessings rather than burdens. After the twins went to bed, the 4 adults sat on Carlos and Jessica's back patio, drinking lemonade and talking seriously about the baby shower plans. Jessica had already booked a community center, created a preliminary guest list, and started researching catering options. "I want this to be special," Jessica said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I want you to feel celebrated and supported. I want you to know that this baby is wanted and loved by people who matter." "Even if Mom's not one of those people," Carlos added quietly. Andrea reached across the table and squeezed her brother's hand. "Thank you, both of you. I can't tell you how much this means to me." "You don't have to thank us," Carlos said. "This is what family does. Real family." As they were preparing to leave, Jessica pulled Andrea aside in the kitchen. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice low and serious. "Elena called here yesterday." Andrea's stomach dropped. "What did she say?" "She wanted to know if we'd talked to you recently. When Carlos told her about the baby shower, she wasn't happy." "I can imagine." Jessica hesitated, then seemed to steel herself. "She told Carlos he was making a mistake, that he was enabling your irresponsible behavior. She said if we went through with the shower, we were choosing you over family unity." Andrea felt a familiar stab of pain and guilt. "Moby, you shouldn't—" "Stop right there," Jessica interrupted firmly. "Carlos told her that you are family. He told her that supporting your pregnancy isn't choosing sides, it's choosing love over fear. And he told her that if she can't support her own daughter during one of the most important times in her life, then maybe she needs to examine what family unity actually means. Andrea stared at her sister-in-law, amazed. He really said that to her? He really did, and I've never been more proud of him. Jessica's eyes were fierce with protective love. Andrea, your mother has been the center of this family for so long that we all forgot we could exist without her approval. But watching how she's treated you has been a wake-up call. I don't want my sons growing up thinking that love comes with conditions and judgment. That night, as Andrea and Jake drove back to Tucson, she felt something shift permanently inside her. The conversation with Jessica had crystallized something she'd been struggling to articulate. This wasn't just about her pregnancy anymore. It was about what kind of family she wanted to create, what kind of love she wanted to model for her child. Elena had presented her with an ultimatum without even realizing it. Accept conditional love based on meeting impossible standards, or choose unconditional love that celebrated her choices even when they were difficult or unexpected. Andrea was choosing unconditional love. I want to do something, she said to Jake as they drove through the desert darkness. What kind of something? I want to write Elena a letter. Not an angry letter, not a defensive letter. A letter that explains exactly what I'm choosing and why. Jake glanced at her, surprised. Are you sure? After everything she said? I'm sure. Not because I think it will change her mind, but because I need to say it clearly. For myself, for our baby, I need to officially choose the family we're building over the family I was born into. That's a big step. Andrea placed her hand on her stomach, where her child was growing safely and steadily, surrounded by love even before taking their first breath. It's time for a big step. I'm not that scared girl looking for her mother's approval anymore. I'm going to be someone's mother soon, and I want to be the kind of mother that celebrates their children's joy instead of trying to control their choices. By the time they reached home, Andrea knew exactly what she needed to write. The letter would be her declaration of independence, not from family, but from the toxic patterns that had defined her family for too long. She would choose celebration over control, support over judgment, love over fear. It was time to stop looking backward and start building the future she actually wanted. Tomorrow she would put that choice into words. Tonight she would rest in the certainty that she was finally becoming the person she wanted to be.
Writing the letter to Elena took Andrea 3 attempts and 5 days of agonizing over every word. She wrote the first draft in anger, the second in desperation, and finally managed the third from a place of sad but resolute clarity. When she finally sealed the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox outside the Tucson post office, her hands were shaking. The letter was 2 pages of carefully chosen words that laid out her boundaries, her expectations, and her hopes for their relationship moving forward. She explained that she would no longer apologize for her choices or seek validation for decisions that brought her joy. She invited Elena to be part of her grandchild's life, but only if she could do so with genuine support rather than judgment. Most importantly, she made it clear that her silence would be interpreted as Elena's choice to remain distant. 3 days after mailing the letter, Andrea's world shifted again, but this time the challenge came from an unexpected direction. She was in the middle of teaching a reading lesson when the school nurse appeared at her classroom door, looking unusually serious. Mrs. Patterson rarely interrupted classes unless there was an emergency, and Andrea felt her heart rate spike as she approached the doorway. I need to speak with you privately, the nurse said quietly. Can your students work independently for a few minutes? Andrea assigned her second graders a worksheet and stepped into the hallway, her mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened to Jake? To Carlos or the twins? I just received a call from Dr. Chen's office, Mrs. Patterson said gently. There's been an issue with some of your blood work. They want you to come in this afternoon for additional testing. The words hit Andrea like a physical blow. She'd had routine blood work done the week before during her regular prenatal appointment, and everything had seemed normal.
Dr. Chen had been pleased with her progress, commenting on how healthy she looked and how well the baby was developing. "What kind of issue?" Andrea managed to ask. "They didn't give me details over the phone. Just said it was important that you come in today if possible." Andrea's first instinct was to call Jake, but he was in meetings all afternoon, preparing for a big presentation to the City Planning Commission. Her second instinct was to call Elena, an automatic response that she caught herself making and felt ashamed about. Even now, when facing something scary, part of her still wanted her mother. Instead, she called Carmen Rodriguez. "I can be there in 20 minutes, Carmen said without hesitation when Andrea explained the situation. "My prep period is next, and I can get coverage for my last class. You shouldn't go through this alone." Andrea felt tears of gratitude welling up. This was what real support looked like. Someone dropping everything to be present during a crisis, no questions asked, no judgment offered. Carmen arrived at the school within 15 minutes, looking slightly out of breath but radiating calm competence. She helped Andrea arrange for a substitute teacher for the remainder of the day, then drove her to Dr. Chen's office while Andrea sat in the passenger seat trying not to catastrophize. "It could be anything," Carmen said gently as they sat in the medical building parking lot. "Maybe your iron levels are low, maybe you need to adjust your prenatal vitamins. Don't assume the worst until you know what you're dealing with." But Andrea's mind was already spinning with terrible possibilities. Genetic abnormalities, miscarriage risks, complications that could threaten both her health and the baby's. She thought about Elena's harsh words, another mistake, and wondered if this was the universe's way of proving her mother right. Dr. Chen's waiting room felt different this time, charged with anxiety rather than hopeful anticipation. When Andrea's name was called, Carmen squeezed her hand and promised to be right there when she came out. Dr. Chen's expression was serious, but not alarmed as she reviewed Andrea's chart. "I wanted to see you today because your blood work showed some irregularities that we need to monitor closely. Your glucose levels are elevated, which could indicate the beginning of gestational diabetes." Andrea felt her stomach drop. "Gestational diabetes? What does that mean for the baby?" "It's manageable," Dr. Chen said quickly, her voice reassuring. "Gestational diabetes affects about 10% of pregnancies, and with proper monitoring and dietary changes, most women go on to have perfectly healthy babies. But it does mean that we need to be more careful about your nutrition and exercise, and we'll need to monitor you more frequently." Relief flooded through Andrea so intensely she felt dizzy. Manageable. The word was like a lifeline. Not a catastrophe, not a confirmation of Elena's negativity, just a challenge that could be handled with information and care. "What do I need to do?" Dr. Chen handed Andrea several pamphlets and a glucose monitoring kit. "We'll start with dietary modifications, reducing simple carbohydrates, increasing protein, eating smaller meals more frequently. I'm referring you to a nutritionist who specializes in pregnancy nutrition. And we'll also want to see you every 2 weeks instead of monthly, and you'll need to monitor your blood sugar at home." The next hour was spent learning how to use the glucose meter, scheduling follow-up appointments, and receiving a crash course in pregnancy nutrition management. By the time Andrea emerged from the office, she felt overwhelmed, but empowered. This was something she could handle, something she could control through her own actions and choices. When Jake got home that evening, Andrea had already researched gestational diabetes extensively online, created a meal planning system, and started a blood sugar tracking log. She had also called Jessica, who'd connected her with a friend who'd successfully managed gestational diabetes during her own pregnancy.
"You've been busy," Jake said, looking at the stack of printed articles and meal plans spread across their kitchen table. "I needed to feel like I was doing something constructive instead of just worrying," Andrea admitted. "This is scary, but it's also manageable if I stay on top of it." Jake pulled her into his arms, and she leaned into his solid warmth. "We'll figure it out together," he said simply. "Whatever adjustments we need to make, we'll make them." Over the next 2 weeks, Andrea threw herself into managing her condition with the same intensity she brought to everything else in her life.
She met with the nutritionist, completely reorganized their kitchen to eliminate tempting carbohydrates, started taking evening walks with Jake, and tracked every meal and blood sugar reading with obsessive precision. The discipline was challenging, but also oddly satisfying. For the first time since Elena's devastating reaction, Andrea felt completely in control of some aspect of her pregnancy. She couldn't control her mother's attitude or her family's dynamics, but she could control her blood sugar levels and her baby's health. The baby shower planning continued despite the gestational diabetes diagnosis. Jessica had thrown herself into the project with enthusiastic determination, sending Andrea daily updates about decorations, games, and menu options. When Andrea explained about the dietary restrictions, Jessica immediately adjusted the entire catering plan. Low-carb appetizers, sugar-free desserts, and plenty of protein options, announced Jessica during one of their planning calls. This is going to be the healthiest baby shower in Phoenix history. Andrea felt overwhelmed by her sister-in-law's thoughtfulness. You don't have to go to all this trouble. It's not trouble, it's love, Jessica interrupted. Besides, half our friends could probably benefit from eating healthier anyway. You're just giving us an excuse to serve food that won't send everyone into a sugar coma. The week before the shower, Andrea received an unexpected phone call at work. She was grading papers during her lunch break when her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. Andrea, this is your Aunt Rosa. Andrea nearly dropped the phone. Rosa was Elena's younger sister, someone Andrea hadn't spoken to in over a year. Rosa lived in California and rarely visited Arizona, but she'd always been warmer and more approachable than Elena. Aunt Rosa, how are you? I'm calling because Elena told me about your pregnancy. Rosa's voice was gentle but serious. She also told me about the difficulties you've been having with the family. Andrea braced herself for another lecture about timing and responsibility. Instead, Rosa surprised her. I want you to know that I think she's wrong, Rosa said firmly. I've been trying to talk sense into your mother for weeks, but she's too stubborn to listen. So I'm calling to tell you directly. I'm excited about this baby. I think you and Jake will be wonderful parents, and I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Tears sprang to Andrea's eyes. Thank you. That means more than you know. I also want you to know that Elena is miserable, Rosa continued. She's angry and hurt and feeling like she's lost control of her family. But she's too proud to admit she was wrong and too scared to acknowledge that her fear is making her push away the people she loves most. I wrote her a letter. I haven't heard back. She got it. She read it 3 times, according to Carlos. But responding would mean admitting she made a mistake, and you know how your mother feels about admitting mistakes. Andrea did know. Elena's need to be right, to be in control, to never show vulnerability, had been a constant throughout Andrea's childhood. It was part of what made her such a formidable single mother, but it was also what made her incapable of repairing relationships when she had damaged them. I can't keep waiting for her to change, Andrea said quietly. No, you can't, and you shouldn't. But I want you to know that some of us see what you're doing, and we're proud of you. You're becoming the mother you want to be instead of the mother she thinks you should be. That takes courage. After Rosa hung up, Andrea sat in her empty classroom for several minutes, processing the conversation. It was validation she hadn't expected. Support from a quarter she'd forgotten existed. Elena's family wasn't monolithic. There were people who saw the situation differently, who understood that supporting Andrea didn't mean betraying Elena. That evening, as Andrea and Jake took their usual walk through their neighborhood, she felt stronger than she had in weeks. The gestational diabetes was under control, the baby shower was just days away, and she was learning that her support network was larger and more diverse than she had realized. I'm starting to think everything happens for a reason, she told Jake as they paused at an intersection. How so? This whole situation with my mom, the gestational diabetes diagnosis, even Carlos standing up to her, it's all teaching me to be more independent, more confident in my own judgment. I'm learning to trust myself instead of constantly seeking other people's approval." Jake smiled, taking her hand as they continued walking. "You're becoming the person you were always meant to be. You're just giving yourself permission to be her." Andrea squeezed his hand, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and her strength. But tonight, walking through the desert twilight with the father of her child, she felt ready for whatever came next.
The baby shower was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late November, when the Arizona desert finally began to offer relief from the brutal summer heat. Andrea woke up that morning feeling a mixture of excitement and nervous energy that had nothing to do with her carefully managed blood sugar levels. Today would be the first major celebration of her pregnancy, surrounded entirely by people who genuinely wanted to be there. Jessica had transformed the community center into something magical. Soft yellow and green decorations adorned every surface, colors chosen specifically because Andrea and Jake had decided to wait until birth to learn the baby's gender. Round tables were set with elegant centerpieces made from succulents and baby's breath, and a stunning dessert table featured an array of sugar-free treats that looked too beautiful to eat. "Jessica, this is incredible," Andrea breathed as she walked through the decorated space. Her sister-in-law had thought of every detail, from the comfortable seating areas for older guests to the children's activity corner for the few families bringing kids. "You deserve to be celebrated," Jessica said simply, adjusting a banner that read, "Welcome baby Martinez Thompson," in elegant gold lettering. "Your baby deserves to be welcomed into the world with joy." Andrea felt tears threatening. Pregnancy hormones made her emotional, but this was more than that. This was the overwhelming realization that she was surrounded by people who had chosen to love and support her unconditionally. The guests began arriving at 2 o'clock. Carmen Rodriguez came first, bearing a gift bag and a warm smile that immediately put Andrea at ease. Margaret and David Thompson followed, David carrying what was obviously a handmade wooden cradle wrapped in careful packaging. Several of Andrea's teaching colleagues arrived together, laughing and chatting about work gossip that felt wonderfully normal. But the moment that took Andrea's breath away came when Aunt Rosa walked through the door. "Surprise!" Rosa called out, her arms spread wide for a hug. "Did you really think I'd miss my great-niece or nephew's first party?" Andrea launched herself into her aunt's embrace, overwhelmed by the gesture. Aunt Rosa lived in San Diego and worked as a pediatric nurse. Taking time off and flying to Arizona for a baby shower represented a significant investment of time and money. "I can't believe you came," Andrea said, tears flowing freely now. Family shows up. Real family shows up when it matters. The afternoon unfolded like a dream Andrea hadn't dared to have. Games were played with genuine enthusiasm rather than obligation. Gifts were open to genuine excitement and practical suggestions. Stories were shared about everyone's own pregnancy experiences, creating a tapestry of wisdom and reassurance that made Andrea feel connected to a community of women who understood what she was going through. Carmen Rodriguez had brought a beautiful handmade baby blanket in soft yellow yarn, along with a card that contained a list of her favorite parenting books, for when you want research-based advice instead of everyone's random opinions, she said with a knowing smile. Margaret Thompson had compiled a photo album of Jake's childhood, complete with handwritten captions describing his milestones and personality traits. "So you can see what you might be in for," she said with a laugh, as Jake groaned in mock embarrassment. The teaching colleagues had gone in together on a high-quality baby monitor system and several sets of educational toys appropriate for different developmental stages. "We know you'll want to start teaching this baby from day one," said Mrs. Patterson from the school nurse's office. But it was Rosa's gift that made Andrea cry the hardest. Inside an elegant white box was a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant engraved with the baby's due date. Tucked beneath the jewelry was a letter written in Rosa's careful handwriting. "Dear Andrea, this necklace belonged to your grandmother, Elena's mother.
She wore it when she was pregnant with Elena and with me. I had planned to give it to Elena when she became a grandmother, but I think it belongs with someone who understands that becoming a mother is a gift, not a burden. Your baby is lucky to have a mother who will celebrate their existence instead of questioning it. Andrea held the necklace up to the light, watching the pendant catch the afternoon sun streaming through the community center windows. Her grandmother had died when Andrea was 10 years old, but she remembered a woman who was gentler than Elena, more quick to laugh, more willing to find joy in small moments. She would have been so excited about this baby, Rosa said quietly, fastening the necklace around Andrea's neck. She always said that every child is a miracle, regardless of timing or circumstances. The contrast with Elena's absence was stark, but no longer painful. Andrea realized that she'd stopped waiting for her mother to change her mind, stopped hoping for an apology that might never come. Instead, she had built something better, a chosen family of people who celebrated her choices and supported her dreams. As the shower began to wind down, Andrea found herself sitting in a circle with the women who had become her support system. Carmen was sharing a story about her first pregnancy scare, Margaret was offering to teach Andrea how to make homemade baby food, and Jessica was already planning the next family gathering around the baby's estimated arrival. "I have something I want to share," Andrea said during a lull in conversation. The women turned to her expectantly, and Andrea took a deep breath before continuing. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be pregnant and having a baby shower without my mother present, I would have thought it was the saddest thing imaginable. I spent so much of my life trying to earn her approval that I couldn't imagine celebrating anything important without her validation.
She paused, touching the pendant at her throat. But sitting here with all of you, I realized that I'm not missing anything. I'm not lacking something essential. I have everything I need to be a good mother, to raise a healthy child, to build the kind of family I want to have. Carmen reached over and squeezed Andrea's hand. That's the most important lesson you can learn before becoming a parent. That you are enough, exactly as you are. I want my child to grow up knowing they're wanted and celebrated, Andrea continued. I want them to know that their existence is a joy, not a problem to be solved. I want them to understand that real love doesn't come with conditions or timelines or requirements to meet other people's expectations. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. That child is going to be so lucky to have you as a mother. We all are, Jessica added. Lucky to have you in our lives, lucky to watch you become the parent you're meant to be. As the guests began to leave, each offering final hugs and promises to stay in touch, Andrea felt a profound sense of completion. Not because her story was over, but because she'd finally stepped fully into the life she wanted to live, rather than the life others expected her to live. Jake helped her load the gifts into their car, shaking his head in amazement at the generosity they'd received. "We're not going to need to buy anything for this baby for the first year," he said, laughing at the pile of clothes, toys, books, and equipment. "Look at this," Andrea said, pulling out the card that had been attached to the group gift from her teaching colleagues. Inside, each woman had written a personal note of encouragement and advice. Reading through them, Andrea was struck by how many mentioned her strength, her wisdom, her natural maternal instincts. "They see something in me that I'm still learning to see in myself," she told Jake as they drove home through the desert sunset. "What's that?" "That I'm ready for this, that I can trust my own judgment about what's best for our family." That evening, as they sat in their living room surrounded by baby gifts and feeling overwhelmed by the love they'd experienced, Andrea's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and felt her stomach clench. Alina. Andrea looked at Jake, who raised his eyebrows in question. She took a deep breath and answered. "Hello, Mom?" "Andrea." Elena's voice was different, softer, more uncertain than Andrea had heard in years. "Rosa told me about the baby shower today. She said it was beautiful." "It was." A long pause. "I want to apologize." The words hung in the air between them. Andrea felt Jake's hand find hers, anchoring her to the present moment, to the life she'd built for herself. "I was wrong," Elena continued, her voice breaking slightly.
I was scared and I let that fear make me cruel. I called your baby a mistake, and that was unforgivable. I've been thinking about what you wrote in your letter, and you were right. I was trying to control your life because I couldn't control my own fears. Andrea felt tears starting, but they weren't tears of desperation or hurt. They were tears of recognition, of a relationship that might finally be able to heal. I want to be part of my grandchild's life, Elena said quietly. If you'll let me, if you can forgive me. Andrea looked around their living room at the evidence of the community she'd built, the support system she'd created, the love she'd cultivated. She thought about the woman she'd become over the past months, stronger, more confident, more certain of her own worth. I like that, Andrea said finally. But it has to be different this time. I won't apologize for my choices anymore, and I won't accept criticism disguised as concern. If you want to be part of this baby's life, you have to trust that Jake and I know what we're doing. I can do that, Elena said quickly. I want to do that. They talked for another 20 minutes, tentatively rebuilding a bridge that had been burned months earlier. Elena asked about Andrea's health, about the gestational diabetes, about their preparations for parenthood. Her questions were genuine rather than judgmental, curious rather than critical. When they finally hung up, Andrea felt exhausted, but hopeful. The relationship with Elena would never be what she'd once wanted, unconditional support and enthusiasm, but it might become something better. Honest, boundaried, and based on mutual respect rather than obligation. How do you feel? Jake asked. Andrea considered the question seriously. Complete, she said finally. Not because she apologized. I was already complete without that. But because I know that I can handle whatever comes next. I've learned to trust myself, to build my own support system, to celebrate my own choices. She placed her hands on her growing belly, where their child was developing safely and steadily. In a few months, she would hold this baby in her arms and begin the greatest adventure of her life. She would make mistakes, face challenges, encounter situations she'd never imagined. But she would do it all as the woman she'd chosen to become. Confident, supported, surrounded by love, and finally free from the need for anyone else's permission to be happy. The baby kicked against her palm as if in agreement. Andrea smiled, ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.